The cold does not make a sound. It simply enters. Caelum Vance felt the first warning in the sharp crack of his lungs the moment he stepped onto the Montana territory. He was a 23-year-old man fleeing a past of smoke and iron, seeking a future that cost 12 days of impossible labor before the ice sealed his tomb. With no family, no horses, and nothing but a raw iron bar as his tool, he was the perfect target for the indifference of a town that placed bets on how many days he would last. But the true danger wasn't the weather, it was the eyes watching from the ridge. In that autumn of 1880, Caelum would learn that to take root in stone soil, sometimes you must first surrender your soul. And before I tell you what happened next, where are you watching from? City and country in the comments. It matters more than you think. To understand the desperation that drove a man like Caelum Vance to the Bitterroot Highland, one must first understand the suffocating weight of the Appalachian coal mines. In those days, in the jagged valleys of Pennsylvania, the sky was not something you looked at. It was a distant memory, a thin ribbon of gray visible only for a few minutes between the end of a shift and the setting of a sun you never felt on your skin. Caelum was a child of that darkness. He was born into the scent of damp earth, stale sweat, and the metallic, biting tang of coal dust, a scent that settles in the back of the throat and remains there, like a ghost, for the rest of a man's life. His father, Caelum Vance, had been a master smithy for the mining conglomerates. He was a man of fire and anvil, a titan of muscle who spent 18 hours a day in a shed that felt like the antechamber of hell, repairing the iron teeth of the machines that ate the mountain. Caelum believed in a simple, cruel geometry. If you worked the iron hard enough, if you gave the company enough of your marrow, the iron would eventually forge a life of dignity for your kin. He taught Caelum the language of metal, how to hear the difference between a brittle weld and a true one, how to respect the heat, and how to remain silent when the world demanded too much. But the collapse of 1878 proved that the mountain had no respect for dignity. Caelum remembered that morning with a clarity that hurt. The silence was the first thing that broke. It wasn't a loud noise. It was a deep, low vibration that felt as though the earth itself had decided to exhale. He remembered standing outside the smithy, watching a single crow take flight from a blackened pine, and then the screams began. The mine didn't just collapse. It swallowed the future of the town. When the dust settled, the company didn't offer prayers. They offered debt notices. The tragedy didn't end at the mine shaft. The black lung, that slow, creeping shadow of the mines, claimed his mother less than a year later. Caelum sat by her bed in a shack that smelled of lye and despair, listening to her coughs. They sounded like gravel being shifted in a tin pan, a dry, rhythmic scraping that signaled the lungs turning to stone. He watched her hands, once capable of weaving warmth into the coldest winter nights, grow thin and translucent like parchment. By the time he was 23, Caelum was the last scrap of fabric from a coat that had been torn to pieces. He was a man with the hands of an artisan and the soul of a widower, fleeing a past that felt like a slow execution. He sold everything. The heavy anvil that had belonged to his father for 30 years was sold to a rival smithy for a fraction of its worth. The tongs, the hammers, the leather aprons stained with the salt of his father's brow, all gone to pay for a ticket to a place he had only seen on crumpled maps. The only thing he kept, hidden in the deep pocket of his charcoal-stained coat, was a single 3-pound bar of raw, untreated iron. It was cold, heavy, and jagged. It was a fragment of a life that no longer existed, a piece of his father's ghost that he refused to let go. The journey westward was an odyssey of soot and iron. The northern Pacific line moved like a great iron serpent through a landscape that grew increasingly alien. Caelum spent days pressed against the glass of the passenger car, his eyes tracing the transition from the lush, suffocating greens of the east to the bruised purples and scorched, skeletal yellows of the territories. The air in the car was thick with the smell of cheap tobacco, unwashed bodies, and the constant rhythmic jolting of wheels that seemed to chant a single word: nowhere, nowhere, nowhere. He slept upright on wooden benches, his joints aching with a dull, persistent throb that reminded him of the factory floor. He ate hardtack and dried apples, saving every cent, his mind a feverish map of what-ifs. Every time the train stopped to take on water or coal, Caelum would step onto the platform and breathe. The air was changing. It was losing the damp, heavy moisture of the coast and taking on a sharp, predatory edge. It smelled of sagebrush, ancient dust, and the terrifying promise of infinite space. When the train finally deposited him at the edge of the Bitterroot Highland, the sheer scale of the horizon nearly brought him to his knees. In the mines, the ceiling was always 6 feet above your head, a constant threat of burial. Here, the ceiling was a vast, indifferent ocean of blue that stretched so far it made his head swim. The wind didn't just blow, it searched. It carried the grit of the volcanic plains, settling it between his teeth like sandpaper and coating his skin in a fine layer of gray ash. His boots, already worn dangerously thin, crunched on the volcanic grit as he walked toward the township, a collection of wooden buildings that looked like they had been dropped from a great height and left to rot. There was no welcome. The men leaning against the livery stable didn't offer a nod. They offered a cold, calculating stare. They saw exactly what he was, a greenhorn with hollowed cheeks and a factory cough, a boy playing at being a man in a country that broke titans. They saw a victim. But as Caelum reached the land office, his hand went instinctively to the iron bar in his pocket. He felt the cold hardness of it against his thigh. He wasn't just here to file a claim under the Homestead Act. He was here to perform an act of reclamation. He was a man who had already seen his world end once, and that gave him a dangerous kind of courage. He walked into the office, the door creaking with a sound like a bone snapping in the frost. Inside, the air was stagnant with the smell of old ledgers and stale tobacco. The clerk behind the desk, a man named Sterling Thistle, didn't even look up at first. He was busy scratching names into a book, names that Caelum suspected were already being erased by the wind outside. $12 for the filing fee, Thistle muttered, his voice as dry as the paper he handled. And 5 years of your life to prove you're worth the dirt you're standing on. Most don't last the first winter, son. The Highland doesn't take kindly to strangers, and it takes even less kindly to those who come with nothing but hope. Caelum didn't blink. He placed the coins on the scarred wooden counter, one by one. The sound of the silver hitting the wood was the only noise in the room. He wasn't just buying land. He was buying a chance to exist without a ceiling over his head. He was signing a contract with a wilderness that didn't know his name and didn't care for his survival. As he walked out of that office, a legal landowner of 160 acres of rock and sage, the sun was beginning to dip behind the jagged teeth of the mountains. The shadows were long, blue, and cold. He had 12 days before the first snow. 12 days to build a life out of stone. The transition from the station to the Highland was a journey into a different kind of silence. Caelum had spent his remaining coins on a meager inventory, a rusted sack of winter rye, a bag of salt, a few pounds of dried beans, and a spade with a handle that had been cracked and bound with wire. It wasn't enough to build a kingdom, but it was enough to buy him a month of survival. He hitched a ride on a supply wagon heading north, the driver a silent man who looked at Caelum's iron bar and then at his thin wrists, shaking his head with a grim, unspoken prophecy. When the wagon stopped at the edge of his claim, the driver simply pointed at a desolate, wind-swept slope and said, "God didn't finish this part of the world, son. He just left the rubble." Caelum stood alone as the wagon creaked away. The Bitterroot Highland lived up to its name. The soil wasn't soil at all. It was a treacherous layer of volcanic grit and obsidian shards, held together by the stubborn roots of sagebrush that clung to the earth like drowning men. He had no oxen to break the ground, no horse to haul timber. He had only the iron bar and his own frame, which felt lighter and more fragile with every gust of the biting north wind. The first night, he slept under the stars, the cold seeping through his coat like water through a sieve. He woke with frost in his hair and the realization that the sky he had admired so much was his greatest enemy. Without shelter, the Highland would consume him before the first week was out. He began to dig. Since there was no wood for miles and he lacked the strength to haul stones alone, he decided to go into the earth rather than above it. He chose a small embankment where the volcanic rock seemed thinner. Every strike of the spade sent a jarring shock through his shoulders, a vibration that hummed in his teeth. The ground was an intricate puzzle of roots and buried boulders. By noon of the third day, his hands were a map of broken blisters and raw red flesh. He wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from his father's old work shirt, but the blood soon soaked through, turning the white fabric into a rusted brown. The work was a slow, agonizing meditation. To distract himself from the hunger that began to gnaw at his stomach, a hollow, aching reminder of his poverty, Caelum focused on the rocks he was unearthing. He didn't just throw them aside. He began to stack them, forming a low, jagged wall around what would become the entrance to his dugout. He noticed that some of the stones bore strange, ancient markings, or were smooth and black as glass. As he cleared the earth, he felt as though he were peeling back the skin of the world to see the bones beneath. By the 8th day, he had carved out a space no larger than a grave, 6 feet deep and 5 feet wide. He roofed it with sagebrush branches and a thick layer of the very sod he had struggled to break. It was a dark, cramped hole that smelled of damp minerals and old dust, but when he crawled inside, the silence of the wind was replaced by a heavy, earthy stillness. He had his first victory, but the earth does not yield easily. With his shelter secured, Caelum turned to the task that would define his 5-year contract: cultivation. He had to break a certain acreage of land to prove his claim. Without a plow, he was forced to innovate. He took the 3-pound iron bar, his father's legacy, and used his meager supply of firewood to build a small, intense fire in front of his dugout. Using a heavy rock as an anvil, he spent a night of grueling labor hammering the end of the iron bar until it was flat and sharp. He wasn't just a farmer, he was a smithy of necessity. The next morning, he harnessed himself to the task. He tied a length of rope around his chest, attaching it to the modified iron bar, which he used as a hand plow. He leaned his entire weight forward, digging the iron into the stubborn grit. The physical toll was immense. His breath came in ragged, steaming gasps, and the rope burned into his shoulders, leaving deep purple welts. Every inch of progress was a battle won against a landscape that wanted to remain wild. The silence was broken only by the sound of his own grunts and the metallic scrape of iron against stone. By the 10th day, he was a shadow of the man who had stepped off the train. He had lost weight, his eyes were sunken, and his movements were slow and deliberate, like those of an old man. But he had broken a small patch of ground, a dark, jagged scar on the gray hillside. He sowed his rye with hands that shook, whispering the names of his brothers with every handful of seed he cast into the dirt. For Thomas, for Samuel, for little Elias. He wasn't just planting grain, he was burying his grief, hoping that something living would finally grow from the ashes of his family. On the eve of the 12th day, the temperature plummeted. The sky, which had been a bruised purple at sunset, turned a flat, ominous slate gray. The wind died down, replaced by a stillness so profound it felt like a held breath. Caelum stood outside his dugout, his body aching in places he didn't know could feel pain. He looked at his small, scarred field and then at the mountains. A single crystalline flake of snow landed on the back of his hand. It didn't melt immediately. It sat there, a tiny, perfect star of ice, announcing the arrival of the White Death. He had no more wood, very little food, and a roof made of dirt. He crawled into his hole, pulled the heavy iron bar close to his chest for warmth, and listened to the first whispers of the blizzard hitting the highland. The baptism was over. The trial had begun. Winter in the Bitterroot Highland did not merely arrive. It occupied the land like a hostile army. For 4 months, Caelum Vance lived in a state of suspended animation within his dirt-walled sanctuary. He learned the intimate architecture of silence, the way the frost crystallized on the interior stones, the rhythmic drip of melting snow during the rare midday thaws, and the hollow, persistent ache of a stomach that had forgotten the meaning of a full meal. He survived on a strictly rationed handful of beans and the occasional rabbit he managed to snare in the frozen sagebrush. By the time the first tentative thaws of March turned the volcanic grit into a treacherous gray mire, Caelum had lost the last vestiges of his youth. His face was a map of sharp angles and hollows, his eyes burned with a hard, feverish light, and his hands, though scarred, had grown as strong and inflexible as the iron bar he still kept by his side. But as the ice retreated, A new kind of shadow fell over his claim. The Bitterroot Highland was not as empty as the land office maps suggested. For decades, the vast, unfenced stretches of the territory had been the private kingdom of men like Gideon Vane. Vane was a cattle king of the old breed, a man who viewed the Homestead Act not as a law, but as a personal insult. To him, the sodbusters and nesters were a plague, small men with small dreams who dared to put fences across the ancient veins of the earth. Vane's ranch, the Obsidian Cross, sat 10 miles to the north, but his cattle moved wherever the grass was greenest, and his influence moved even further. The first confrontation happened on a Tuesday in late April. Caelum was out in his small field, his chest harnessed once again to his makeshift iron plow, struggling to expand his planting of winter rye. The sound of hooves didn't reach him until they were nearly upon him, the soft thud of horseflesh on damp earth. He stopped, wiping the stinging sweat from his eyes, and looked up. 3 riders sat on the ridge, their silhouettes dark against the blinding spring sky. In the center was a man on a massive, soot-colored stallion. He didn't wear the flashy attire of a city man. He wore duster coats stained with the history of 1,000 miles and a hat pulled low over eyes that saw land only in terms of profit and power. This was Gideon Vane. "You're digging a grave, son," Vane said, his voice surprisingly soft, yet carrying a weight that made the air feel heavy. "The problem is, you're digging it on a path where my steers have walked since before you had hair on your chin." Caelum didn't unhook himself from the plow. He stood his ground, the rope cutting into his shoulders. "The papers in Valentine say this is Section 14. My name is on the deed for the improvements. I'm not digging a grave, Mr. Vane. I'm planting a future." Vane let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like 2 stones grinding together. "A future? In this rock? You're a blacksmith's boy from the smokestacks. You think you can break this land? This land breaks men. It's meant for hooves and horns, not for fences and frail hopes. I'll give you $20 for the filing fee and the work you've done. Take it, go back to the station, and find a trade that won't kill you before the summer heat hits." "My price isn't for sale," Caelum replied, his voice raspy from months of disuse but steady. "I made a promise to people who aren't here to hold me to it. I'm staying." Vane didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He simply adjusted his reins and looked at the small patch of rye, the green shoots just beginning to defy the gray dust. "Choices had costs, Vance, even when they're the right ones. Remember that when the sun goes down." The riders turned and galloped away, leaving Caelum alone in a cloud of rising dust. He thought the past had finally stopped chasing him, that the mines and the soot were far enough behind. But the prairie had a way of remembering, and men like Vane had a way of ensuring that no one ever truly felt free. The costs Vane mentioned began to manifest within 48 hours. It started with the water. Caelum had spent weeks digging a primitive irrigation trench from a small, seasonal spring that seeped from the rocks above his dugout. On Thursday morning, he found the trench filled with boulders, stones too heavy for a single man to move without hours of grueling labor. Then came the accidents. A dozen of Vane's steers strayed through his claim in the middle of the night. They didn't just graze, they trampled. By dawn, half of Caelum's painstakingly planted rye was a mess of crushed stems and mud. The isolation, which had been a quiet companion during the winter, now became a weapon used against him. In the small township 5 miles away, the storekeepers began to look away when he entered. Prices for seed and salt mysteriously doubled when it was Caelum Vance asking. The local preacher, a man who spoke of charity for all on Sundays, suggested during a chance encounter on the road that perhaps Caelum's presence was disruptive to the established order of the valley. He was being squeezed, not by iron claws, but by the cold indifference of a community that feared the cattle king more than they valued the law. Every night Caelum sat outside his dugout, the iron bar resting across his knees. He watched the horizon, the orange glow of Vane's campfires visible in the distance like the eyes of a predator. He was exhausted. His body was a collection of aches, and the welts on his shoulders from the plow harness had never truly healed. The temptation to take the $20, to find a warm bed and a job in a foundry where the rules were clear, was a constant, seductive whisper in his ear. But then he would look at the stones he had pulled from the earth, the stones where he had carved the names of his brothers. If he left, their names would be swallowed by the sagebrush. If he stayed, he was inviting a war he couldn't possibly win with muscle alone. The hardest part wasn't the work, it was being watched. Every time he moved a rock, every time he carried a bucket of water, he felt the eyes of Vane's scouts from the ridges. They were waiting for him to break. They were waiting for the moment his spirit finally succumbed to the crushing weight of the Highland. But Vane didn't know about the coal mines. He didn't know that Caelum Vance had been raised in a world where the ceiling was always falling, where the air was poison, and where you learned to breathe through the soot or die. One evening, as the shadows of the Bitterroot Mountains stretched across his ruined field, a lone rider approached. It wasn't one of Vane's men. It was a woman, her face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, riding a mule that looked as weary as Caelum felt. She stopped at the edge of his clearing and looked at the trampled rye and the blocked trench. She didn't offer pity. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a small, heavy bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Vane doesn't own the wind," she said, her voice sharp and weathered. "And he doesn't own the law, though he pays for the lease on it. This won't fix your rye, but it might help you sleep." She dropped the bundle. It hit the ground with a heavy metallic thud. Before Caelum could speak, she turned the mule and vanished into the gathering dusk. Caelum unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a spool of something new, something the locals spoke of with both fear and fascination: barbed wire. It was a thin, jagged vine of steel, meant to do what a single man could not: hold the line. But Caelum knew that stringing that wire was more than a farm chore. It was a declaration of war. He looked at the wire, then at his father's iron bar, and finally at the dark silhouette of the Obsidian Cross Ranch. The loop was open. The peace of the Highland was over. The summer of 1881 arrived with a heat that did not merely warm, it punished. The Bitterroot Highland transformed into a furnace of gray dust and the sharp rhythmic snap of drying vegetation. Caelum Vance, now driven by an obstinacy that bordered on madness, did not flinch in the face of Gideon Vane's pressure. He stretched the barbed wire, that devil's rope, along the southern boundary, his hands protected by strips of hardened leather, his chest still bearing the silvered scars of the plow rope. Every wooden post he drove into the volcanic soil felt like a nail in the coffin of Vane's old empire. However, Vane was not a man of thoughtless violence. He was a man of systems. In July, the offensive shifted tactics. Instead of hired guns, a new figure appeared, an inspector from the General Land Office, dispatched by an anonymous tip claiming that Vance's claim was fraudulent and the land uncultivable by nature. If the inspector agreed, Caelum's homestead contract would be nullified on the spot, and he would be cast out as a common squatter. The inspector, a man named Elias Thorne, a name that felt like an ironic echo of Caelum's own past, arrived under a midday sun, accompanied by Gideon Vane himself, who watched from horseback with a frost-cold smile. Thorne carried no weapons, only a leather-bound ledger and a compass. "Mr. Vane alleges you are wasting federal soil on a ridge that cannot sustain life, Vance," the inspector said, wiping the grit from his brow. "The law requires actual improvements and agricultural production. All I see here are rocks and a hole in the ground." Caelum, whose clothes were so saturated with dust they appeared carved from stone, said nothing at first. He led the two men to the center of his property, far from the slope where the winter rye had been trampled. There, at the lowest and most arid point of the claim, Caelum had spent the last weeks removing colossal boulders that other men would have spent a lifetime avoiding. "A blacksmith's work isn't just about creating," Caelum said, his voice raspy but unshakable. "It's about discovering what hides beneath the crust." He pointed to a deep pit, excavated by hand with the help of his modified iron bar. Where there had once been only volcanic debris, something impossible now shimmered. A pool of crystal-clear water, fed by a deep-seated spring Caelum had discovered by tracking the moisture in the deepest stones. He hadn't just planted rye, he had planted a well. Around that small source of life, Caelum had transplanted small fruit tree saplings and a garden of vegetables that defied the heat. It was an island of green against the absolute gray of the Highland. Inspector Thorne leaned down, tasted the water, and looked at Caelum's hands. hands that were permanently curved to the shape of his tools, with nails blackened by earth and knuckles thick with effort. "Mr. Vane forgot a detail in his report," Thorne remarked, scratching furiously into his ledger. "He said the land was sterile, but sterility is in the eye of the man who refuses to work. What I see here is not fraud, it is a triumph." The tension in the air was nearly solid. Vane tightened his reins, his face darkening with a silent, murderous fury. A legal defeat was more humiliating than a physical one. He had the cattle, the gold, and the influence, but Caelum Vance had the literal proof of his sweat engraved into the geology of the place. The inspector declared the claim valid and exceptionally productive considering the circumstances. That night, after the officials had departed, Caelum sat at the mouth of his dugout. He was exhausted, his body trembling with the weight of accumulated fatigue. But a new clarity filled his mind. He had won the first judgment, but he knew the cost would be high. Vane's hatred was now personal. The silence that followed was not one of peace. It was the silence of a storm changing direction. "Choices have costs," he whispered into the dark, clutching the iron bar that was now worn smooth by use. He had secured his right to the land, but the true test, the trial of the soul against the total isolation Vane would now impose, had only just begun. 5 years. In the Bitterroot Highland, 5 years are not measured by calendars, but by the depth of the scars on one's hands and the height of the trees that refuse to die. Caelum Vance's time on those lands reached its legal conclusion in 1885. He was no longer the hollow-chested boy fleeing the soot of Pennsylvania. He had become a man made of sinew and silence, someone who had learned that freedom is not the absence of burdens, but the choice of which burdens to carry. Gideon Vane never confronted him openly again after the inspection. Instead, the cattle baron tried to suffocate him with isolation, but the Highland played a trick on him. Caelum's well attracted others. Small families, weary of Vane's tyranny and the aridity of the plains, began to settle on the fringes, forming an informal community that saw the smithy of the canyon as a symbol that it was possible to bend that land without breaking oneself. The isolation that was meant to be Caelum's tomb became the foundation of something new. On the day of his final proof of residency, Caelum did not go to the town office. It was the official who climbed up to his property to hand him the final patent. Caelum received the document with hands stained by the soil that now belonged to him by both divine and human right. He led the official to the center of his plot, where an orchard of apple and cherry trees was beginning to bloom. There, in the center, stood no statue, but the old 3-pound iron bar, now buried vertically in the ground as a boundary marker, polished by the wind and gleaming under the Montana sun. Shortly after, Caelum's life ceased to be a narrative of survival and became one of permanence. He met Lyra, a woman who had arrived with a caravan of weavers and who, like him, carried in her eyes the recognition of someone who had already lost everything. They didn't marry out of convenience, but out of a silent understanding that 2 survivors build stronger walls than those who have never known the storm. Together, they replaced the dugout with a house made of the volcanic stones Caelum had hauled from the field. Stones that still bore the carved names of his brothers, now integrated into the foundation of his home. The story of Caelum Vance was, for a long time, just another dusty entry in the archives of the Montana Territory. But for those who live in the Highland, he is the man who proved that nature does not negotiate, but it respects persistence. He didn't defeat the mountains. He learned to speak their language. The boy who arrived with 12 days left before winter ended his journey as the patriarch of a valley that was once only ash and bone. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is choose a difficult freedom over a comfortable constraint. Caelum died at the age of 74, sitting under the shade of an apple tree that grew beside his well. They say that in his final breath, the air no longer smelled of the coal of his childhood, but of the sweet aroma of ripe fruit and damp earth. He left behind 160 acres of a world he forged himself, proving that as long as there is iron in the soul and water beneath the rock, no man is truly lost. Have you ever chosen a path that everyone told you would be your end, only to find it was actually your beginning? Share your story in the comments. It matters more than you think.